Hi, in this tutorial we'll be taking a look at the improvements made to the texture exporter, as well as the addition of repeat last export. The texture exporter can as usual be found under the channel palette, right mouse click, export flattened, and here we have the export custom channel selection. The same under the regular export, so unflattened exports. We have another one here. And in extension pack 4 there's also now a icon at the bottom of the channel palette. And a default hotkey Shift E has been set, so you can access the dialog quickly. So here we have the new extension pack dialog. One of the first additions is already visible at the top of the dialog. We have a new filter system. So in here you can, for example, comma separate multiple words. You can deactivate the filter, invert the filter, turn case sensitivity on and off. So in this case, for example, if I type lowercase AO, it wouldn't find it. If I turn off case sensitivity, it would find it. And also these filters are sticky, meaning that, for example, if you always just want to see certain channels, like the base channel, the base color here, the AO, when you confirm the dialog, the next time you relaunch the exporter, these filters will still be around, so you can configure your filtering once and always just see whatever you need. Also, if you use the Add All button, so this has replaced the previous Export Everything checkbox. If you click the Add All, it will also just add the filtered channels to your list for export. Another addition is the use of presets. So presets can be found here, and they allow you to save your current list of channels to export. So for example, if I just create a new preset and name that test and close the dialog and reopen it. Now if I choose the test preset, I will have populated my export list with the previously saved channels. The presets work based off the channel name, meaning that even in another project, as long as the channel name is the same, the presets will correctly populate the export list. Let's take a quick look at some of the default presets. We've seen that when we launch the dialog, we launch it with the clear export list, meaning that the right side, the export list, is completely empty. If by default you want to have, for example, your currently selected channel in the channel palette added to the list, you select the selected channels only and you click on this little pin icon, which will set the currently active preset as the new default preset whenever the dialog is launched. So now if I relaunch the dialog, selected channels only is active, meaning that the exporter will automatically populate the export list with the currently selected channel. We have some other presets. The last exported channel, in this case, is the same as the one previously, meaning that the curvature was last exported and it's getting populated. The second last exported channels preset applies to all objects. So if you have more than one object in your scene, if you load the preset last export channels all object, the exporter would take a look at the names of the channels of the last exported channels and then apply this filtering to all objects in your scene. Meaning, for example, if I have a second object that also has a curvature channel, then this curvature channel would also be added to the export list. Next up, let's take a look at some of the changes for the path and templates. So the path is the default texture export path that you have set on your project. You can set this path, or you used to be able to just set this path by the project path dialog, which is another extension pack feature. And in here we have a texture maps export text field where you can set a custom path just for this project. So this is where this path usually gets read from. You can now also change this path for your project directly in here. So for example, if I make a new folder test, and if I were to export now, let me just quickly export this once. You can also see we have a new dialog, like a little bit of a progress dialog that has been added, and a lot of status reporting has also been added in. So we can now see our export time, export path, etc. And the same information is also printed to the Python console, by the way. However, just to not get off point, now you see the previously added test folder is no longer there. So this is a change from previous extension pack versions for the exporter, where previously the path would always be remembered. Now, in order to have it stick, you need to click on the pin icon, and now a new project default path has been set for any texture exports. You can always revert back to what was previously there. So even if you just close the project and reopen the project, it will still remember what was there previously, and you can just revert back. The same thing applies to the template field. So for example, I've made a change here, but I can revert it back to the standard for my project, which was a TIFF extension. But if I want to make a change, you just click on the pin icon, and now a new default file template for flattened textures has been set. We also have some new options here. In this case, it is disabled because this is the compression settings for your XR files. So if I type in a XR file extension, this will become enabled and allows you to set a compression for your XR formats. This compression setting is a Mari global setting, meaning that any change you make here will be automatically picked up by the default Mari exporter, and vice versa as well. Any change made to the default Mari exporter will be propagated to the extension pack dialog. A new feature, an addition, is the export in background. This is a feature that Mari had for quite a long time, but that was always a bit hidden away in the preferences. So with export in background on, Mari will, on export, bake a channel and then save the channel to disk using a background process, meaning that you can already continue working, or the next channel can start baking while the files are written to disk. So this can speed up your overall export times a little bit. However, if you have a lot of channels, the background processes might stack up quite a lot, which might eventually actually lead to slower exports. So it's a bit of a back and forth a little bit. If you have a lot of channels, you should probably turn it off on export, like if you're exporting a lot of channels. If you're just exporting one or two, turn it on. It's definitely not hurting. Save project before export. This is something I kind of learned the hard way through some crashes, so I decided to add this, and I usually always have it on just because it's a nice way to snapshot your project when you export. One thing, the execute post processes you can see is disabled here, and that is because export in background is turned on. So if you don't know what the post process is, basically it allows you to attach a script to your export. For example, for XR MIP mapping or TX conversions or DDS conversions or whatever. So you can execute a shell script here, and you can see we have a lot of variables that the exporter can pass through a script. So you can read out, for example, the file path of each file that came out of Mari, etc. However, if export in background is on, unfortunately, this does not work at the moment, so this is why it's disabled. Not much has changed in the main options section, so we have export flattened as usual. Only modified UDIMs. There have been quite a lot of bug fixes in recent Mari versions from the Foundry that make this a lot more reliable, and I also added some bug fixes, so from what I've seen, it works very well now, so don't be afraid to use it. Full patch bleed is not really a new feature, but I actually turned it off now by default in this release, because some of you had reported that the Mari extension pack exporter was running a bit slower than default Mari exports, and the reason for this was quite simply that the full patch bleed option was on by default in my exporter. Basically, full patch bleed will dilate your texture outside of the UVs to completely fill your entire texture space, and this is quite an expensive process. So this is why it actually, in some cases, can take quite a long time compared to having it off. If you turn it off, it doesn't mean that Mari doesn't do any texture bleeding at all. Whenever you, for example, do a paint stroke or run certain filters, Mari by default will do texture bleeding. So if you already have texture bleeding, if you turn off full patch bleed, it doesn't mean that automatically there won't be any patch bleed at all. Just with full patch bleed on, basically Mari will look at the final channel and then restart any patch bleeding and throw away any old one. So for VFX, it's a good idea to have it on, at least for the final export, I guess. But I frequently actually turn it off and only, apply it when needed. So especially if you're working and testing, you want to do fast exports. Enable small textures. For those that don't know, when Mari exports a UDIM that doesn't have any paint applied or any, basically it's just a flat color with enable small textures turned on, Mari will export the patch at an 8x8 resolution, so you can save a bit of disk space. It's not really anything new, it's been around for a while. Export resolution has been added in the previous Mari extension pack version. One little change here is now that the resolution won't reset itself again to full. Not quite sure how good an idea it is. I've fallen into the trap myself a little bit. Basically, if you export at quarter resolution, the next time you start the dialog, it will still be at the lowest, at the resolution previously selected, which in my case was 1/8 resolution. So I don't know. I like using it just to quickly iterate on exports and to save time during testing. Some new features at the bottom, we have the export color space and export bit depth. Mari 3 supports obviously like a very comprehensive color space, procedure. So the exporter had to be updated to also support export color spaces. And I'm going to quickly go over a little bit of color space in Mari. I'm not going to bore you too much, I hope, but it's kind of necessary. So on a channel, you usually have your color space options down here. And this is usually referred to as the native color space or data color space, meaning it's the way Mari interprets incoming data. So Mari has a native color space for everything, which is incoming data. Then it has an internal working space, which is color space, which is, the working color space, usually linear. And then everything also has an output color space. So the output color space is determined by your settings on your project. So you have under File, you have a settings option. And in here, for example, you can say, okay, anything that is 16-bit should be interpreted as linear or like default to linear. Actually, my Mari is just hanging up. 1 second. All right. That was just a little bit of a hang up here. Anyway, the project settings determine what Mari will interpret data as default. So for example, here, if I set this channel to sRGB and then go to the Mari default exporter under export flattened, export current channel flattened. So you can see, even though the channel is set to sRGB, the color space on export had as default to automatic linear. And this is related to these settings I just showed you, because basically I was telling Mari in my settings that anything that should be 60-bit should default to linear. So this is actually quite a little bit of an annoyance, because I personally like just managing my color space down here and not keeping track of my export color space. So in my exporter, I've just added some options at the top here, which is the from channel native role, from channel working role, and from channel output role. So by default, it's the native role. So basically, the exporter will make sure that the output color space is always the same as has been specified in your channel palette, so as in the native role. Then we have the working role, which is the Mari internal color space, usually linear. And then we have the output role, which is basically exactly what we've been seeing with the standard exporter. So it'll read the output role on a channel. You can also obviously pick any other. And it's also sticky, meaning that any selection you make here will persevere across multiple sessions. Next up, we have the export bit depth, and this is a setting. Ideally, you should never need to touch it, because I hope I made a good job in adding a good default, which is dynamic. But basically, it allows you to override your bit depth on export. So it's a non-destructive export. So for example, let's say I have this channel in 16-bit and I want to export it in 8-bit. You could just specify 8-bit, and the exporter would internally, temporarily, I have to say, bake it down still in 16-bit, but then convert it to 8-bit. The dynamic is the default, and what the dynamic does is it will try to export your channels at whatever bit depth they're in the channel palette, unless it can't. And it can, for example, let's say I have here a curvature channel, it's 16-bit, and I'm trying to export into a JPEG file. Now, obviously, I have to take off dynamic in this case, so I'm just gonna choose 16-bit here and see what happens. JPEG does not support 16 or 32-bit data, so in this case I would have to either convert it to 8-bit, my channel, pick another format that supports actually 16-bit, or set it to dynamic, which will basically bake this channel right into 8-bit data. The same thing obviously works for EXR, so if you have an 8-bit channel, previously or default Mari cannot export EXRs from an 8-bit channel. However, using the extension pack dialog and set to dynamic, you can straight up export into an EXR even from an 8-bit channel. Again, ideally you should never have to touch this. I hope I did a good job with it, but it's there for completion. Next up, let's look at a new feature that is related to the export, but not part of the actual custom channel selection exporter, which is the repeat last custom channel export. So we have under export and export flattened a repeat last custom channel export option. We have a new icon here, and we also have a hotkey Shift R. If I just press Shift R, you will see the export dialog pop up straight away, and it'll repeat the last export identically to the way it was before. So it will export the same channels to the same path with the same file name, the same settings, the same bit depth, everything. It will even go as far as remember if you've previously chosen a export selected patches, it will even remember what patches you exported if you want that. So for example, if I export a patch selection, let me just, for example, select this UDIM. So if I exported last from this UDIM and I press Shift R or repeat last custom export, it would export again the same UDIM even if you have something else selected. This is something of a default behavior you can change. There's an option under the export or export flattened. Down here, there's a checkbox, repeat user's original selection. So if you untick this, Mari will, if you've exported a selected patches export last, will always use your current selection instead of the last selection. So I hope this is clear and understandable. Usually, if you chosen export selected patches and do a repeat, it will always repeat exactly the same thing, meaning including the selection you had previously, unless you turn the checkbox off. Anyway, this covers the changes and additions on the exporter side, and see you in the next tutorial.